Hello there guys, and welcome to Mad Doc Minis. Get yourself strapped in for some retro 40k fun, because in this video I am going to convert the old card ruins and terrain that used to come in the second edition starter box. This video is directly inspired by what Ed from Minisodes did on his channel, so a massive thank you to Ed for the inspiration, and I hope I can do him proud. I'm going to put my own slant on things as ever. I've done a little bit of eBay sniping and saved up enough of these ruins to finally have a good go at this project. The ruins would originally come on these card backing pieces, which you would push them out of and fold them into L-shapes, securing them in the corners with little tabs. You'd get a whole table's worth of terrain in the 40k second edition starter box. Great times to be alive. Now, they are quite flimsy, they're not too realistic, so I'm going to make them a little bit more robust and a little bit more appealing, whilst respecting the nostalgia for this project. I decided early on that I wanted quite thick walls for my ruins, so I'm using this 1 centimetre thick foam board, which is double the thickness of the regular stuff. With all my careful eBay sniping, I've managed to accumulate nearly 2 complete sets of this old card terrain, and I'm going to put that to my advantage by using the duplicates to have detail on both sides of the wall. So I'm going to sandwich a bit of foam board in between 2 duplicate sections, kind of like this. It's going to go in between them. Now that's quite wasteful potentially, you may argue, but I think it's going to look really good when it's done. I drew around the shape of the ruins with a pencil on the foam board and then set about cutting it out with a sharp knife. Definitely not going for perfection here, guys. It is Mad Doc Minis after all. They are ruins as well, so I think this whole thing is quite forgiving, but you could do a much more refined job than me if you wanted to. Once I had finished cutting around the shape, I did a bit of a dry run just to make sure that I was going in the right direction, using the card ruins as a template. I then held it firmly in place and just trimmed around the outline a little bit more just to neaten things up. Once this had been done, it was ready to be glued into place, so I used a bit of super glue to fix the foam board down. This did feel a bit like I was desecrating a 30-year-old antique. Apologies if you're cringing. Hopefully you'll agree it's worth it in the end, guys. That's all I can say to that. Once that had been done, I was ready to build the other section of the L, and I went about this in a different way. I glued the foam board down first and then cut around it. Now, you could do it either way. I preferred the first method because it really meant that I wasn't risking damaging these card ruins. You have to go very carefully if you're doing it this way, but I wanted to show both methods as they're both good in their own ways, really. Once I had finished cutting out the second section of the L shape, the main structure of the ruin was complete. I just wanted to attach the other duplicate section of wall on the inside, but as you can see, the alignment doesn't match because of the thickness of the wall, so we're going to have to cut this down a little bit to make it work. Once again, maybe avert your eyes here, guys. It's quite distressing watching me destroy these relics. But once I've cut that down sufficiently, I glued those into place. And yes, you do end up with less than perfect joins on the inside. A lot of the time it didn't bother me. Other times I fudged things a little bit using spare little bits of offcut. So anything that I cut off of these, I tended to save in a little pile just in case I needed to make some alterations in the corners. Little offcuts like this. All right. So once I was happy with all that, I decided to make a base out of 5mm thick foam board, which is the normal stuff. I drew a shape around the ruins and set about cutting that out. And I do bevel the edges on these as well. I did debate whether to actually use a base at all, because you could just sit them on the tabletop as is if you wanted to, but I decided that since I was going for a bit of a retro vibe, I wanted the base because that's the way they tended to do things back in the early 90s. Now, beveling the edge is quite easy. Just use a sharp blade and a slight sawing motion and you'll create a nice bevel all the way around, and that will make the whole thing look so much better. There you are. So that's the base completed. Now, really, I should have PVA glued the whole thing down, but I was looking at eradicating unnecessary steps because I had so much to get through. So I put a small bead of super glue on the card just to act as a temporary adhesive, just to kind of hold it in place on the base. And then I used cocktail sticks cut to the right length and pushed those up through the base and into the middle section of foam board in between the card ruins. I did this at different angles. angles and diagonals, and that held it in place really, really firmly. But do be aware, you probably should use PVA glue on the bottom of the ruin as well for extra security. Now, some of the ruins like this were really quite small, and they didn't really allow me to properly use the thickness of wall that I wanted. Check this out. So if I put the foam board up, look, you'll see that it obscures that opening in the window. So on sections like this, I actually opted just to build them straight. Once they're folded straight anyway, you can't really see the seam very much. So I just cut out a bit of foam board and we have a couple of straight wall sections. No problem. I used cork cuttings in the corners just to kind of like smooth the transition between the ruins and the base, and I also added some details on the base, in this case a plastic skeleton. And I also want to draw your attention to the corner here. So this is what I was talking about earlier. Some of the corners are a bit more offensive than others. You see on the outside here it's nice and neat, on the inside it doesn't match up. So in cases like this I used one of those bits of offcut that I was talking about and just glued it in on a bit of a diagonal, trying to kind of match the colours as best I could, but not worrying too much really. So I cut that down, glued it in. We've got a little bit of a hole on top which can be easily filled in with a little bit of offcut of foam board or whatever. Once that was all done, it was time to seal all the exposed foam sections, including around the edge of the base and on top of the wall, with 2 to 3 coats of Mod Podge. And I allowed plenty of time in between for it to dry. It was a little bit of a drag. I was trying to reduce my steps down to get through it all, but well worth it. After that, it's time to base it. So I spread some normal PVA glue down all over the base using an old brush, and then came in with 2 lots of basing materials. The first lot I used was actually from Geek Gaming Scenics, and I prioritised using the larger stones in this just to add a bit of a rubble effect. I did it quite sparingly. I mean, you could go really overboard with you know, the kind of ruined rubble look, but I wanted quite flat terrain sections. I wanted a bit of a compromise between realism and usability. After that was done, I came in with some good old builder's sand and put that all the way over the top, and in the end that created a really nice varied texture for the base for not too much money. Builder sand is really, really cheap, of course. Once that was done, I put a little bit of PVA glue over the top of the wall sections and spread that out with the old brush again. And then I came in with some finer sand. This is kind of like ornamental sand, which I saved from something years ago. And I spread that over the top of the wall. It's a bit finer than the basing sand, and it just adds a little bit of texture and interest to the top of the wall sections, which otherwise would just look too smooth. A couple of the ruins came with these raised floor sections, which ordinarily would be attached with a tab and slot mechanism. However, that wasn't really going to work for me because I've got that foam board in the middle that's kind of getting in the way of that. So I decided to get rid of the tabs on the floor section using a ruler and a sharp knife. Don't use a plastic ruler like me, guys. Use a metal one, of course. I just misplaced mine and had to crack on. But once that was sorted, that'll go in the corner very nicely. But it didn't really look thick enough, so I decided to create a bit of a base for it using some 5mm foam board, and that's going to look like reinforced concrete. It's going to look a bit more robust and realistic. I actually modeled a little bit of kind of rebar coming out of that as well, and I did that all over the build, coming out of the walls in various places, just using narrow gauge wire as well, and that just makes it look a little bit more convincing, I think. It was then time to seal down all the basing materials, and I did this with cheap white craft paint. And now you really probably should use PVA glue to properly seal down basing materials first and then use your paint over the top. However, I really wanted to kind of reduce the steps on this build, as I've said before, because I had 16 of these things to get through. As it happens, the paint worked perfectly well with sealing down the sand, and I didn't really have any problems, so there you go. Once that had been done, I decided to stain over the base using Space Rules Grey contrast paint. I wouldn't necessarily advocate using GW paints on terrain projects like this, as it can be quite expensive, but I really like the colour and the effect, so I decided to just go for it really. And it turned out really nicely and definitely matched in well with the colours of the terrain. I tidied up around the edges. Any white exposed bits of foam around the edges got a little bit of a coat of a standard Mechanicus grey just to try and blend it in a little bit more. Once that was done, I went over the whole base with a bit of a dry brush just to, you know, bring out some of that detail and make it look a little bit more retro, a little bit more 40k basically. At this stage, it was a case of tidying up, really. I painted in the details, added grass tufts all over the build, and also coloured in some of the exposed corners on the cardboard with a Copic marker just to blend them in a little bit more. If you have enjoyed the content, guys, please consider liking and sharing. It really does help my little channel to grow. And if you are not already subscribed, please consider giving us a sub. I would heartily recommend that you check out Ed's original video over at Minisodes, and I will provide a link to that in the video description. It was the direct inspiration for this, and it will transport you to the glorious days of 2nd edition. In the meantime, guys, please enjoy some glamour shots and take care. Cheers.